Hi, I'm Charles Wyckoff, and it's an absolute honor to be here today with a good friend and colleague across the retina space, Tom Ciulla. Tom is MD, MBA, and currently serving as Chief Medical Officer and Chief Development Officer at Clearside Biomedical. Tom is an ophthalmologist by training, actually a vitreoretinal surgeon who has worn many different hats over the last 2 decades. And today we'll unpack his personal journey and his transition from training into academics and through the private practice world into the industry of developing pharmaceuticals. He's played his hand in some incredibly innovative processes, and we look forward to hearing about that. Tom, thanks for being here.
Well, Charlie, thanks for being here. I have to say that I feel really honored to have been in retina over the past 2 decades. We've all witnessed just incredible amounts of innovation, which has changed our field, has changed the way we practice medicine. It's changed patients' lives for the better. So it's been a really, really fun journey, and I'm very excited to share some thoughts with you and whoever's watching.
Awesome. Let's start with your personal journey, right? You were undergrad at Harvard, you then went back to the West Coast at UCSF Medical School, you then went back to Boston for residency at Harvard, and finally finished with your vitreoretinal fellowship at Tufts. Excellent institutions. What or who along your path inspired you over the course of these long, tough years?
So great question, and we have to put it into the context of history. So I started my residency in the early 1990s, and back then, it's amazing to think, in really just 2 decades, back then we would actually laser a patient's fovea if they had wet AMD based on the macular photocoagulation studies.
Yeah.
So I had the great good fortune of doing my residency at Mass Eye and Ear in the early 1990s, and I was exposed to just these really brilliant young faculty members who actually, they in turn worked under Judah Folkman, and folks like Joan Miller, Evan Gregudis, Lord Aiello, Tony Adamus. I mean, these were like the folks that really started this whole wave of disruptive innovation with anti-VEGF therapy. And it was really exciting and an inspiring time. And then, later on, when I finished my training in Boston, I joined the faculty at Indiana University. And to be honest with you, I'd grown up in the Boston area and went to medical school in California. And I really didn't know much about the Midwest, but it turned out to be a great place. I had been married early, and great place to start a family and a practice. It's actually the only medical school in the state, and it's the largest medical school in the country with 11 campuses. And I had a traditional academic job with a lab and lab technicians. And I got to work with some really brilliant people like Ron Danis and Alon Harris, who were doing some really innovative work. We had an angiogenesis lab and clinical trials. And I recall in these early clinical trials, these are these Lucentis trials, I was just expecting patients to have less vision loss. And I recall how patients improved vividly beyond my expectations. And I realized then and there that the folks that I was exposed to at Mass Eye and Ear had been on to something that was truly disruptive, and we're off to the races at that point. It was just a super exciting time.
So you spent 6 years on faculty at Indiana University, and then you transitioned into private practice at Midwest Eye Institute. Tell us about that transition. Many doctors spend their careers in one or the other, and you have the unique perspective of having been fully immersed in both the university-based practice and then in private practice, where you continued to do academics. Give us sort of the best and worst of both worlds.
Yeah, and so again, we have to put this in the context of history. So our field was exploding with innovation at that time. And I like to think about therapeutic innovation. It's always caught my fancy, but we also had imaging innovation. OCT was coming along with anti-VEGF, and of course, all the surgical innovation. And I actually transitioned from a traditional academic role to this evolving academic private practice role, which really didn't exist until then. And I think it was born because of all the innovation, and it was literally exploding by that point in the early 2000s. And quite frankly, the university was still in the old model, and they were slow to keep up with all the human resource allocation and the clinical trial infrastructure. So as I transitioned over to sort of an academic private practice model, I was able to control and channel resources and staffing for clinical trials, which the university really couldn't do very quickly. And I ultimately hired and trained my own 3 full-time research coordinators who worked on my trials only. And I think at the same time, I was able to transition from a traditional hospital-based surgical retina practice where you're doing, cases in a general hospital late at night. I was able to transition immediately to a surgery center setting, and it was really just, incredibly efficient. So I think at that point, folks who were in retina started to realize that they could pivot much more quickly and allocate resources more efficiently to sort of match all the evolution and all the disruptive innovation and evolution in our field.
So you
So
were
I think
doing
that's
basic,
what happened.
so you were doing some basic science research when you were on university staff. Did you continue any of that basic science research, or did you leave that behind when you transitioned to private practice?
Great question. So I had a lab along with Ron Danis. We had this lab where we had all these, quite primitive from today's standards, but back then we had a lab with all these different animal models of angiogenesis. We had pigs and rats and mice and rabbits and even primates at one point. And we were doing PDT and anti-VEGF research in the lab. It was really exciting and fun. But frankly, once all the trials started taking off, I really didn't have time to do that.
Yeah.
And so really became more involved in clinical research and really never went back to doing lab research myself, although
Okay.
now I direct lab research.
Yeah.
But yeah, there was a bit of a transition then.
And we'll get to that. So then in 2015, you went and got your MBA. So I know a lot of people talk about this. This seemed to be really popular maybe 10 years or so ago. And kind of now it seems like fewer people are getting an MBA that are in research. But tell us what drove that decision and what that process was like.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I've taken you through this historical perspective of retina and how it was changing and it changed the nature of practice. But fast forward 20 years beyond that, and frankly, I found myself stagnating. I found myself doing just an ever increasing number of repeat injections in the clinic, and even some of the clinical trials, which at the time were really exciting when you didn't expect patients to get better. Some of the clinical trials became Me Too trials, and you were just trying a therapy that might last a little bit longer or it might be a little bit better, but really wasn't super exciting or innovative. And so I realized that I didn't want to just do injections all the time, although it's great, you're helping lots of patients. I wanted to help patients in a potentially more sustainable and exponential way, maybe with a more direct role in therapeutic development, especially after having been involved in lab research and clinical research. So I decided to go back and get an MBA, and it was really a turning point for me because it really broadened my horizons. It helped me think beyond my own little retina silo to thinking more systematically about healthcare problems and solutions. I would say that, folks ask me this all the time: was it worth the effort, or what? Do you use it? And the answer is no. I mean, I think we had 51 credit hours. I took accounting. I took 3 courses in operations management.
Yeah.
Leadership and so on and so forth. So I'm not sitting at Clearside calculating internal rates of return or anything like that. But what I think it does do is it does broaden your horizons. It does force you to think more systematically about problems. It does help you think about leadership and leading teams, in communication skills. So unlike medical school, where it's very individualized, at least it was when I went, the MBA programs are much more collaborative. You work in teams, you do team projects, and that's really how the real world works, especially in corporate environment.
Fascinating. So then after that, you focused on sort of moving into industry, where you've played an incredible hand in developing some amazingly innovative technologies. 2015, you went to Optotech, you were involved in medical strategy and many other things. But then I want to focus on your time at Spark Therapeutics, right? Because there you joined that team in 2017 and you played a significant role in the development and ultimate market introduction of Luxturna, of course, the first approved gene therapy for genetic disorder, period, across all of medicine. I mean, an amazing advance that obviously built on the work of Gene Bennett and Al McGuire and many, many, many others across the space. What was that like working on that project and then bringing that to market? Give us the context of what that looked like.
Well, that's a great question, and it was super exciting. And when I was at Spark, I had the same feeling I had back when I first started
Mm,
Art of Fellowship, where anti-VEGF changed the world for the better. And you had that same feeling at Spark that we were doing something that was truly historic. It was going to be sort of leading the way with a truly disruptive, innovative therapy that would serve later as a platform for other gene therapies. So it was really an exciting time, and it made me feel, frankly, young again, like I was back in the heyday of anti-VEGF, and see these videos of these kids who literally, can't walk through the
yeah,
mobility test, and then, even a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, be able to walk through these mobility tests and go trick-or-treating for the first time, or
yeah.
see the stars at night for the first time. It
Wow.
was really, really exciting. And so I think what I learned at Spark, uh, again, similar to anti-VEGF, is that there were a lot of challenges. I think the actual innovation of gene therapy is really interesting and exciting, but there were a lot of other innovations, particularly with developing a novel endpoint like multi-luminance
Yeah,
mobility testing, like introducing ocular gene therapy treatment centers and training surgeons, like thinking about orphan disease
yeah.
therapies, which really hadn't existed in retina previous to this, thinking about pricing, reimbursement, the business model, just
Yeah,
a lot of new territory for retina. And it was
yeah.
really fun to be involved in it.
I'd love to unpack that a little bit more, Tom. That development of a novel primary endpoint for FDA approval, right? This mobility test. Tell us why you had to go down that path as an organization, right? Why couldn't you just use visual acuity? Tell us how you came up with that idea as a team. And I think that there's some real meaningful learnings for things like stem cells and other things that are being developed in the space now, where we probably need to develop alternative endpoints that aren't currently in use. Give us that thought process.
So this is really the work of Dan Chung, who's still at Spark. Dan is an IRD specialist and super smart. I had the great good fortune of working with so many brilliant people at Spark, and Dan was one of them. But this is really the work of Dan Chung. But basically, as you know, retinitis pigmentosa and related disorders are rod disorders. They affect night vision and peripheral vision, and really don't affect visual acuity till late in the disease. And so we really needed an endpoint that captured those qualities. And the multi-luminance mobility test does that, but it's also a test of real-world visual function. So the 7 different lighting conditions, they're meant to simulate lighting in different scenarios in the real world. And the mobility test itself is meant to simulate walking around obstacles in the real world. And the FDA, as you know, is interested in these outcomes. And so I think what many people don't know is there was a lot of work in validating that. So
Mhm.
Spark did that. Spark validated it in conjunction with the FDA. Um, or,
And what
or
does that mean to validate it? Did you have to do it with people with different levels of impairment and show that there was a dose dependence on sort of their outcome depending on the severity of disease? What does that mean to validate this test?
Great question. So uh, the actual testing or the validation of the MLMT was almost a trial in of itself. There were patients who, there were normals and patients who went through this test all the way from baseline to a year later. And they had to assess for reproducibility.
Yeah.
They had to assess for correlations with visual fields, with full field light sensitivity, for example. And there's a whole paper just on validation of the MLMT. And basically, any novel endpoint, needs to have some value for, or predictive value for correlating with the patient's functioning in the real world. And so there was a lot that went into that.
So one other question about Luxturna. How did you price the product? Tell us a little bit about orphan drug pricing in the US.
Yeah, great question. So there's an Orphan Disease Act of 1983, I believe, and that was put in place to foster therapies for rare diseases. Some of these rare diseases. These children have basically lost the genetic lottery. And up until that time point, companies did not want to develop therapies for these patients. So what the Orphan Disease Act did was it would provide incentives like tax credits and exclusivity. And then ultimately, these therapies are valued. There's a whole science behind valuing. I got to work with a health economics outcomes research team on this, and there's methods to determining the value. And some of these therapies, Luxturna included, depending on how you model it, have been shown actually to save money for society, even though they are expensive. So I think it's an important lesson for retina is that our therapies, whether it's anti-VEGF or some of these gene therapies, provide a huge amount of value for society. And Luxturna in particular, without going into all the details, Luxturna in particular, if you can have a child get to a higher level of education, a higher level of occupational training, be productive in the workforce, pay taxes, not require as many caregivers, that ends up creating an enormous value for society. The interesting paradox is that in the US, commercial insurers obviously pay for care, but they don't pay for social services, the government does. In other countries, like in the EU, the government pays for both. So the government, since the government's both the payer of social services and of medical care,
right.
Sometimes the realization of the value is an easier argument. Whereas in this country, there's different commercial payers are paying for therapy and the government's paying for social services.
Fascinating. Okay, and then in 2018, you transitioned over to Clearside. You were the chief medical officer. Now you're the CMO and the chief development officer. What originally attracted you to Clearside?
So actually, when I was at Ophtotech, I learned a lot of lessons, and that is that biotech involves a lot of risk. And as many people in the retina world recall, is that Fovista failed in phase 3,
right.
Stock crashed, but basically we had some funding left over, and I got to do business development with the team for 8 months after Fovista failed. And that was a great experience. So I got to go around to all these different companies and learn about their assets. And what I realized then and there was that the 3 next waves of innovation for retina were in the short term, drug delivery, in the midterm, gene therapy, and in the long term, cell therapy. And so obviously when the opportunity came to work at Spark, I jumped at that. It was a great experience. And then what attracted me to Clearside was that it basically focused on drug delivery, sustained delivery, drug delivery. So many of the therapies we think about now involve sustained release or sustained delivery of anti-VEGF. And Clearside has a great platform for that. And also potentially a platform for gene therapy as well as therapy for ocular melanoma, because you can target the relevant space. So that's what attracted me to Clearside. However, 2 weeks after I joined Clearside, one of the phase 3 trials were unmasked. They didn't meet their primary endpoint. The stock crashed. A lot of the leadership left.
Right.
Closed down trials. And it was really, almost personally, at one level, you could think it would be a disaster, but actually it's been a great learning experience. Unlike Spark, where I learned about a new subject matter, at Clearside, I've learned about rebuilding a company, building a team, and that's what led to the chief development officer role, to think about a pipeline, to think very systematically about unmet needs, therapies that could go into the space, and how that would potentially serve a niche. So that's sort of a taste of what's happened at Clearside. It's been a fun ride. We have a CEO, George Lezeski, who's been an absolute pleasure to work with. And, I think we've made some nice progress.
And you have a lot going on. You have a lot of shots on goal here at Clearside moving forward. What's maybe one or two that you're personally most excited about seeing move forward?
Well, as I mentioned, after these phase 3 trials failed, we had to sort of rebuild a pipeline. And I'm really excited about the fact that we were able to work on a tyrosine kinase inhibitor, finish some preclinical studies. file an IND, have it be accepted by the FDA, and we plan to have the phase 1/2A clinical trial up and running before the end of the year. I
Excellent.
think very exciting because we can deliver that therapy to the affected tissues. It potentially has many month durability, and may serve an unmet need for patients with common blinding diseases.
Awesome. Look forward to hearing about that more in the future. So maybe just to close out, what's some advice to other colleagues, right? You hear a lot of retina specialists that are involved in trials and in sort of academic work, interested and thinking about transitioning over into the pharmaceutical industry. You've had some incredible experiences. You've seen the good, you've seen the bad, you've seen the challenges, you've had some great successes. What's the advice you might have for some other clinical colleagues out there thinking about making that transition?
Well, I think what we learned in our MBA program was that oftentimes, in order to move forward, you have to step backward a little bit. You have to be willing to step back and learn. And in retina, we're very much siloed in our space. We're incredible subject matter experts. We go from talking to a patient to looking at an OCT, looking at something that really represents cellular layers in the body. But what we haven't really been good at is leading teams. Though you might lead teams in clinic, there's a lot more complexity in a corporate environment. And you have these subject matter experts that you're leading. They may not be physicians, but they're exquisitely well trained, and they're just as specialized in their fields. They could be the PhDs who've worked in regulatory for 20 years, or have worked in medical affairs for a decade. Or biostatisticians with a PhD. So there's a huge amount of subject matter expertise. And I think the challenge for physicians is that as opposed to being, the captain of your own practice ship or a managing partner in a small group, all of a sudden you have to work with, these incredibly talented teams who really, frankly, know more than you do about industry. And you have to be willing to work in this hierarchy where you report to somebody who reports to the CEO, who reports to the board, who reports to the investing public. And I think that's a transition that is maybe difficult for a lot of our colleagues who are used to being, top of the heap in the practice.
Yeah. Fascinating perspective, Tom. I really appreciate your team tonight. Good luck. Look forward to the conversations ahead.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it. Take care.
You too.